Let's say we want to create a civilization of cultural aliens on another planet. The only rule is that we can't give them any of our own cultural products, no technology or know-how. How would we do it? Is there any law or guiding principle that we can glean from the way societies evolved on our own planet? Clearly, civilizations do not emerge out of nowhere. Before the Sumerian civilization blossomed in what is today the Middle East, there were thousands of years of agrarian farmers and herders. Before the modern West, there was the scientific revolution. And before the scientific revolution, there was the Gutenberg printing press. Before the Gutenberg printing press, there was the invention of paper, ink, and a literate population. We can dimly sense that there must be a relationship between these things, yet how could we possibly isolate them fully? Efforts to untangle these causal links is akin to tracing the lineage of a forest in terms of every plant that had to decompose in its soils, every bird that distributed its seeds, and every rodent that defecated on its roots. Our job is to set the initial parameters, the base environmental conditions that are suitable to grow a civilization. Just as a rainforest will emerge given enough time in an area with a suitable climate, what is the climate in which a civilization can take root? A civilization is nothing but a particularly complex kind of human culture. For most of our species' history, we lived as roaming bands of hunter-gatherers. Every civilization that has ever existed can, in theory, trace its emergence to our foraging prehistory. Our bodies and minds haven't evolved, but our culture, at certain times and places, has. Remembering that our alien population are cultural creatures like ourselves means that nudging them in the direction of civilization is the same thing as promoting the evolution of their culture. What, though, do we mean by culture? All organisms, as put by Richard Dawkins in The Selfish Gene, are survival machines built by genes to carry themselves through time. Human beings are, like every other organism, merely a vehicle for genes to propagate themselves into the future. So if human beings are a vehicle for genes, then culture is a vehicle for humans. Humans function to propagate specific genes, and culture functions to propagate specific humans. Seen this way, we might say that culture is a symbolic or conceptual system whose job is to serve human needs. The needs of humans are like that of all animals, to secure food and reproduce. Culture helps us to do so by encoding and distributing information for how to obtain and process food, but also to show respect, demonstrate loyalty. It provides the rituals and norms for upholding social cohesion. But how on earth do we explain why some cultures became more complex than others? If we can find an answer to that, then perhaps we can isolate the key principles driving their disproportionate growth. We must recognize that culture has no power whatsoever until expressed in human behavior. It is not some gaseous cloud mysteriously governing human affairs. It manifests itself in discrete physical acts: throwing a spear, threading a needle, whistling a tune. Culture is a material phenomenon. As such, it is beholden to the same laws of physics to which humans and every other organism is bound. Can physics really explain something as malleable as culture? The 20th century anthropologist Leslie White thought so. He argued that culture, like all life, is a thermodynamic system. Energy is taken in as sunlight, put to work in the growing of leaves or the lifting of feet, and expended in the form of heat. Why should culture be any different? When there are abundant energy sources like foods to be harvested, soils to be planted in, then the potential for culture to evolve is great. For White, the more energy a population could put to work, the more complex their culture would become. Technology was therefore a key ingredient, as it allowed people to make productive use of the energy sources around them. He formalized the law as energy times technology equals cultural products. What does this formula predict? It predicts that hunter-gatherer societies with simple technology, living in environments that cannot support large populations, will tend to remain small. This is what we see across the historical record, with the Netsilik Inuits of the Arctic and the Kung of the Kalahari Desert as prime examples. The cultures of these groups are perfectly aligned with their ecological reality. Scarce resources make infanticide an acceptable strategy for dampening population growth. Because everybody knows each other, there is no need for large governance structures or distinguished leaders. Communal decision-making comes naturally. White's law also predicts that if circumstances change, if, say, a society with a certain level of cultural complexity moves into an environment with less resources, then its culture will lose complexity. We can see this phenomena at work with the Moriori people of New Zealand's Chatham Islands. After moving from the fertile soils of subtropical New Zealand to the harsh subantarctic Chatham Islands, 800 kilometres out to sea, they proceeded to shed many of their cultural traits. The Chathams were not suitable for agriculture, and so, despite being descended from farmers, the Moriori devolved into a culture of hunter-gatherers, subsisting on seals, shellfish, seabirds, and fish. By the time they had contact with outsiders again, hundreds of years later, they were a small population that had renounced violence, without strong leadership or organization. In contrast, the land the Moriori originally left was packed with Māori tribes producing reliable food surpluses. Not all Māori had to devote their time to procuring food, and so could work as part-time soldiers, craftspeople, fort builders, and toolmakers. The most dramatic growth in culture, however, seems to follow in the wake of technological innovations that unlock new sources of energy. Take the Chumash Indians of California. For 5,000 years, they subsisted on acorns and seafood as an egalitarian society of hunter-gatherers. Large fish were a problem. The Chumash had simple canoes made of bulrush that made hauling large game problematic. A critical technological innovation allowed them to transcend this limitation: the Tomol canoe. Made of redwood or pine, these could be up to 7 meters long and hold 12 people. Crucially, they could now make longer journeys out to sea, allowing them to haul in massive swordfish and tuna. They could also now efficiently move between the mainland and the Channel Islands, a rich source of flint which they used to carve beads from seashells. These beads were valued by inland groups and even became a regional currency. As producers and middlemen for the shell trade, the Chumash were able to profit handsomely. As their population grew, it developed a hierarchy, with chiefs administering over the production of tomols and the seashell beads. Some labourers even came in from outside the Chumash kinship group, forming a multicultural society collectively benefiting off the local industry. What these specific cases illustrate is a general principle, that the more energy input that goes into a cultural system, the more complex that system will tend to become. A simplification of the general evolutionary logic, which admittedly misses the endless historical permutations and exceptions, goes something like this. More resources are able to feed more people, who work to harvest even more resources, which in turn feed even more people. This autocatalytic process extends to technological innovation. Every individual might have some small chance at discovering a new way to string a bow, But the more individuals that are trying, the more likely that one of them will figure it out. And once they do, the whole group will benefit. Every innovation then helps the group to procure more resources with less effort, further accelerating population growth. A growing population necessitates a growing body of rules. The group has to make decisions and mediate conflict. Often the way to do this is to put someone in charge, a chief. As groups grow, competition for leadership splits groups into disparate parts, each following their own leader. The most successful groups are those able to swallow other groups, creating hierarchies of governance. When more than one of these groups are competing for shared resources, conflict will be won by those with superior social cohesion, allowing them to fight more effectively and develop trading networks with other societies. Time and again throughout history, we see civilizations rise in this way through the domestication of plants and animals. The yield obtained by harvesting directly from the chance offerings of nature simply cannot be matched by the intentional cultivation of resources. The reasons why agriculture kicked off initially in some places and not others comes down again to the energy sources available. The Sumerians flourished due to the ease of domesticating high-yield cereal and pulse crops, as well as sheep and goat, all of which had evolved in the favorable climate and geography of the Eastern Mediterranean. Similar stories can be told in China, Central America, and the Andes. The civilizations that rose in these areas hit their natural limits when they exhausted the resource space, which is why we never saw Romans launching rockets into space. The ceiling for our own civilization is clearly much higher, the result of an even higher yield energy source, fossil fuels. The bewildering complexity of our own culture, all our occupations, technology, art, all springs, ultimately, from coal, oil, and natural gas. Augmenting human labor with these sources has led to the highest levels of productivity and cultural complexity in history. Yet, our large-scale exploitation of fossil fuels did not happen in a vacuum. The Romans used to heat their public baths with coal. Over 2,000 years ago, the Chinese were extracting natural gas and oil from wells. Yet it's only very recently that we've used it to power our homes, vehicles, and factories. If we've had the energy source around for so long, but neglected to build a civilization with it, couldn't our aliens fall into the same stasis? It's entirely possible that they could. But then, given enough time, they're likely to figure out how to exploit it fully. Your odds of winning the lotto aren't bad if you buy a ticket every week for 100 million years. The mix of prerequisites that were needed for the Industrial Revolution to take place, I'm nowhere near qualified to survey, but it seems reasonable that they would have emerged at some point. Just as a river might take thousands of years to carve a channel to the ocean, so does cultural evolution proceed to pinch and probe the environment in order to discover some better way of doing things. Whether or not the configuration it finds represents the final peak before regression, or merely another step in the insatiable march towards complexity, is beside the point. Culture never stands still. The prescription for our alien experiment, therefore, is clear. Put them somewhere with a high energy source and wait. White's law tells us that cultural evolution will ride on the back of human productivity. For that to happen, latent energy sources must be tapped. Our aliens may take thousands of years to figure out how to make use of them. They may get the ball rolling, only to degenerate into social anarchy multiple times over. Eventually, though, their probing roots will stumble upon fertile ground, and they will find it a strong foundation for their civilization. At least for a while.